The national debate about so-called two-tier policing has rumbled on for a third day since the conviction of the murderer of Henry Novak. Central to the discussion is the claim from the right that anti-racism training has undermined the police and the delivery of public services more broadly. Here's Shadow Energy Secretary Claire Coutinho expanding on that point on LBC.
Is there two-tier policing in the United Kingdom currently? Good morning.
The problem is this. Racism has been weaponised in our public services. Our public services have been taught that the worst thing that can happen is racism. That is not the worst thing that can happen. Murder is worse. Child abuse is worse. Serious public harm is worse. And what they are being taught to do is prioritise being seen to be anti-racist rather than protecting the public from harm. And we saw that in the case of the Southport killer. We saw that in the case of the Nottingham killer, where someone was not institutionalised because they were afraid of being racist. We saw that in the case of the Manchester bomber, where he was not stopped because someone was afraid of being called racist. So it has to end, and we have to make sure that we can change these things so that the public can be properly protected.
These concerns have been echoed by a minority contingent of Hampshire police, with this reported by The Times. Officers from force behind Henry Novak arrest pressured by diversity course. A Star survey found 1 in 7 felt controlled to feel certain ways by mandatory training, as a minister admits equality guidance is, quote, slightly clumsy. Now, when it comes to Claire Coutinho's comments there, first of all, when it comes to the Manchester Arena bombing, and she says someone said she thought that they were going to be deemed as racist if they stopped this person. This was a private person working for Showtech. This was a privately contracted security guard. That's not somebody in the public sector receiving anti-racism guidance, right? That's not the same thing as the quote kind of DEI thing that they're talking about, the Americanized term in that case. So I don't really buy that argument. When it comes to the Southport killer, what we saw there was total institutional failure. Given this guy had been reported many, many times, he'd clearly been researching all manner of kind of violent acts and stuff like that online. It was clearly had been a problem that should have been recognised by social services and the broader institutional state to recognise this. And it was a failure in terms of funding and in terms of ability to respond to this, rather than people fearing being called racist. And what's interesting is it's a really, really good foil when people do accuse these institutions, like the police, like social services, of institutional failure. It's a really, really easy cop-out clause, right? To claim that we haven't failed, we have been failed. We have been failed by political interference in our institution, rather than the institution itself failing. It's very, very easy to say, we would not do anything wrong were it not for woke, right? Everything here was totally fine until woke happened, and it made all of the problems that we see today, rather than what I can see in terms of historic levels to which the police have failed, has been a problem broadly in terms of the nature of policing in this country, attitudes of policing that we've seen more broadly in this country, and broadly the fact that there's always been some kind of scapegoat to palm these failures off onto, you know? And even in that Times graphic that we showed you there, there's only 1 in 7 police officers who were in the survey who said that they felt pressurized to feel a certain way. And there's not exactly anything close to a plurality, let alone a majority, right? But it's clear there are some people who are very happy to weaponize this in the media to try and make it their ideological attack dog against anti-racism training somehow being responsible here, despite there being precious little evidence that that is the case. But an easy way of the police being able to palm responsibility off onto literally anyone other than themselves. So pervasive, in fact, is this claim that somehow the police have supposedly been captured by DEI, that people have started hallucinating wokeness where none exists, as in this case of one person who called in to LBC.
The more senior police officers, all those jobs have been people with certain characteristics. So LGBT, DEI philosophy basically has led the way when it's come to the selection of senior police officers.
I mean, if you look at chief constables, most of them are white. It's hard to think of many non-white chief constables.
I think that may or may not be true, but I think if you looked at how many lesbians there are, for example, it would be massively disproportionate I would just say go look at the UK chief constables and tell me how many of them are white lesbians, and then tell me what the proportion is amongst the UK population.
There are no lesbian chief constables currently serving in the UK.
Well, that is just simply not true. Look at the chief constable of Derbyshire.
Simon Blatley. I mean, I don't think he's a lesbian woman.
He doesn't sound like one to me.
No.
He
may
be new.
Who was there.
In the States, my information
one
slightly out of
lesbian
date.
chief constable doesn't point to a massive DEI agenda.
There is a huge DEI agenda within the UK police.
Right.
If you speak to actual police officers,
which you previously said there were.
Basically, I'm not in front of a computer, but in the senior echelons of the UK police, in the senior echelons of the UK police, there's a huge, and I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying. How many chief
constables do you think there are in the UK?
I don't know.
0.
Okay.
Yeah, but DEI's gone mad, hasn't it?
See what I mean? They've been told this narrative about the preponderance of equality and diversity and equity and inclusion, etc., throughout all areas of our society. In fact, Reform have made it the thing that they're going to be able to save all this money in local authorities by cutting DEI. Again, DEI is the American term. You should have equality training in this country. But of course, it's all Yankified discourse where, to be fair, I think there is a lot more of this polarization than you get in this country. When you look, for example, at the Equality Act, explicitly rules out things like positive discrimination and indeed racism against white people. That's how our legislation works in this country. You can't actually, it's not legal to hire somebody purely on the grounds of some immutable characteristic should there be a more qualified person there available. That's actually illegal under the Equality Act, which is why these hallucinations only come from received wisdom from political rhetoric, from political actors and the media and the way in which stories are reported, and indeed anecdotal evidence that they see rather than actual data that has allowed them to come to this position where they just believe things that aren't true, where they can hallucinate all of these lesbian chief constables that don't exist. Dahlia, what do you make of the reactions there that we saw from Claire Coutinho and indeed that caller on LBC?
Police officers who are making these claims are weaponizing a political culture in order to evade accountability for what happens under their watch, for what happens in modern policing. And it is cowardly and it is very cynical. This idea that there is somehow two-tier policing that is steeped in anti-white discrimination is so... I find it really difficult to understand how reality can be so completely inverted and widely believed. Because if it is true that there is two-tier policing where the police are so afraid to be seen as racist that they basically don't police people of color in this country, I need you to explain to me, therefore, why every single piece of research demonstrates that at every point of interaction with the criminal justice system, from arresting to charge to prosecution to conviction to sentencing, people of color, including South Asian people, but particularly Black people, are treated far more harshly than their white counterparts. That is just simply a fact, okay? With the data and the evidence that we have, as far as we can make an evidence-based claim, it is the case that Black and brown people are more heavily policed than their white counterparts in this country. Right? Our prisons, the prison population, the proportion of our prison population that are Black is 12%. The proportion of this country's population that is Black is 2 to 3%. So we have a significantly higher proportion of Black people in prison than white people, right? And so obviously, the subtext, right, to the far right, what the far right want to say is not that is a product of institutional racism, but that is a product of some inherent features of Black people that make them inherently more prone to criminal activity. Because when you're saying, okay, I can see that in prison there are, you are X number of times more likely to end up in prison if you're a Black person than if you're a white person, but there's a two-tier policing system that actively discriminates against white people, then what you're saying is that there should be more Black people in prison because you believe that there's something inherently criminal about Black people and people of color. And so we can put aside this idea that there is inherent anti-white discrimination in policing, or that there is anything to do with modern policing that means that they are afraid to harshly police Black and brown people. When you look at actually what sort of DEI training in the police force looks like, more often than not, what it looks like is understanding how different communities will experience crimes differently. So for example, if someone's walking down the street and they are, visibly Jewish or visibly Muslim, and you throw a piece of bacon at them and yell something at them, that takes on a different tone, right? Than if you are if there's someone who doesn't look visibly Muslim or Jewish, they may be, but they don't visibly look Muslim or Jewish. They're not wearing hijab, they're not wearing, a yarmulke. Then hate would not necessarily be taken in as a motivating factor, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about DEI training in policing. DEI training in policing is not saying that if someone is being accused of a racial assault on another person or accused of being racist to another person, then you should restrain them and not believe them if they say that they've been stabbed or they're in pain. That is not what DEI training is about. That's in fact a feature of an endemic problem within our police system. Because let's strip back everything and talk about what actually happened. So one man, right, stabbed another man. The perpetrator's brother calls the police and says, my brother is Sikh and has been racially attacked. The police come to the scene based on the information they hear in the call. They arrest the person who they believe has perpetrated a crime. They immediately restrain this person. They don't allow for they don't try to establish any facts or try to de-escalate the situation. They go in, they restrain this person, they ignore him when he says he's been stabbed and that he can't breathe, and he dies, right? And it then becomes clear that he was stabbed and the person who perpetrated the crime is now serving a life sentence. So the main problem here is that the police arrived on the scene, they saw someone who they have been told has perpetrated a crime, and they proceeded to treat him as less than human, right? And so the question, right, that we need to ask is, why are so many people, and why do people die at the hands of the police in this way, either through, forcible restraint, through not being believed when they say, I can't breathe, or when they say they're in pain or they need medical attention and they are denied that medical attention. In 2008, a very famous case, Sean Rigg, he had a mental health crisis. He was restrained by police, and in very similar circumstances, he died after being restrained and kept in handcuffs. He reported that he was feeling very, very unwell. The police ignored him, and when they finally got him medical attention, the police officer told the medical professional, "Oh, he's feigning unconsciousness." Sounds very similar to what we saw in that clip where Novak says, "I've been stabbed." And the guy goes, "I don't think you have, mate," right? And so in the case of both Novak and Sean Rigg, we have a situation where someone is being dealt with by the police and being denied medical attention and not believed when they say that they're in trouble. So that is the issue, right? And the great irony of it all is that the very people, the very institutions, the very movements that are currently being blamed for the reason why Novak is dead. Now, people are saying, he wasn't killed by police brutality because the coroner said that even if there were ambulance on the scene immediately, his injuries were so severe he would have died. To me, that's a technicality beside the point. The point is that the police should have got him medical attention, but they didn't listen to him or care for him enough to take anything that he said seriously. And the irony is that the people who have been ringing the alarm most on this question of police conduct and having to hold the police accountable and having to really scrutinize police behavior around people that they deem as to be criminals or perpetrators of crimes, the people who've been at the forefront of that are the anti-racists that Farage and Tommy Robinson and all these people are trying to blame for this crisis. In fact, it is people like Marsha Rigg, who is the sister of Sean Rigg, who has said, we have an endemic problem of policing in this country where the police are called for situations that are not appropriate, e.g. if there is a mental health crisis. And when they are called to the scene, they tend to make things worse and they treat people as less than human, right? And they don't listen to them. They don't take care of them. They're, when they say, I can't breathe, or, I need medical attention, I need an ambulance, they're not believed because in that moment, they're a criminal, and a criminal is subhuman. And so that is the question that we need to have, but the conversation that we need to have. But Farage and Tommy Robinson want to completely obfuscate that conversation because they don't want to talk about holding the police accountable. They don't want to talk about scrutinizing the police. They love policing. They want more police. They want the police to be able to rough anyone up and whoever they can whenever they want. They actually would resist moves to scrutinize police behavior. So they're weaponizing this moment to actually not only divert attention from the actual problem at hand, but to actually prevent us from coming closer to the solutions, to prevent the networks of solidarity that could happen, that could actually deal with this issue. Because the people who have actually built the infrastructures of accountability and who have learned how to heal in the wake of a loved one being killed following contact with the police are anti-racist organizations who have been focusing on the issue of police brutality in this country for decades now. Those are the natural allies of people who are concerned about what has happened in that video, not Tommy Robinson, who wants police to be, allowed to run free with absolutely no accountability. So, it's this complete inversion of reality that when we should be having a conversation about why are people dying following interactions with the police? Why do the police think it's okay to say that someone is faking illness or is faking unconsciousness when in fact they are dead or dying? And why then are they let off the hook as a result of that? That conversation is being completely obfuscated by this ridiculous idea that there is institutional racism against white people by the police, despite the fact that you cannot find a statistic that suggests that white people are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system.
And that's the thing, right? You made a really, really, really important point, a really cogent point about these people's attitudes to the police as an institution, right?
Yeah.
Again, going back to what I said before about the idea that the police cannot fail, they can only be failed. They are totally sold on the institution of policing in this country and believe that it is being undermined by ulterior forces from outside rather than it being a problem of policing as such, right? Again, the left, we talked about Ian Tomlinson, we talked about Blair Peach, Alfie Meadows, Spy Cops, all of that kind of stuff. We're the ones holding police accountable. But in their minds, the police's role, as all conservatives has believed the police's role and the criminal justice system's role to be a system which will protect but not bind the in-group and bind but not protect the out-group. And anything that's perceived to be an inversion of that is breaking what they believe the constitution of policing to be. And that's where this problem comes from, rather than it being what it should be, which is an institution that is there to be able to generate positive utility in terms of the way in which we conduct our society, which is what is being undermined here. And there's another point I want to make there here as well, which is that in this case, I really cannot see the justification for why they even think that race was a motivating factor in terms of the treatment of Henry Novak, right? Because they're responding, as far as I'm aware, to a dispatch specifically saying you're there to respond to a racist incident, which is, of course, a crime. Racial incidents are indeed a crime, and they're hence why they were treating him like one. And again, that's a failure of policing. If they had two separate dispatches, they're responding to two calls, they had been told there is a stabbing and a racial incident, maybe someone might have a point. Maybe if IPCO find out that they totally ignored the idea that they'd already been told previously that there was a stabbing, they should be investigated. So don't care about that. Let's talk about the racism instead. Maybe you could say that they weren't.
Which would never happen.
Well, exactly. The idea that would happen is properly ludicrous in my mind. But again, there has to be a justification in their mind as to why there were negative policing outcomes for the in-group. But again, not just in this case, there were many, many, many cases where indeed white people have been outside of protection that they should be given by the police. And under the police's own guidelines, they have already failed. Like the policing guidelines currently say you're supposed to be able to separate people. There was a former superintendent on Matt Allright's show the other day points out you separate these people, you establish the facts, you check for care beforehand, especially in an interaction where they weren't actually at each other's throats at the time the police had arrived. Perfect time and opportunity to be able to assess the situation before immediately condemning somebody to be a criminal. That basic level of policing, which is already as part of their guidelines, had been failed. And no amount of changes in terms of what the anti-racism stuff that they were saying had impacted would change the nature to which that they should have adhered to that guidance. And everyone who's looked at this instance, who's been spoken to by newspapers, by experts, etc., have said that the police failed in this case. Now, when it comes, of course, as we mentioned before, about how we look at the data, the reality is, of course, that there has always been two-tier policing in this country, and it's not white people who get the sharp end of the stick. Pretty much every review into police bias, from the Macpherson Review to the Casey Review, has only ever come to one conclusion in regards to racial bias in policing, and it's that ethnic minorities consistently get treated worse by the police. The evidence for this is overwhelming and is backed up by statistics and studies, when the counter-argument provided for the claims that two-tier policing negatively affects white people has almost always involved the invocation of anecdotes rather than hard data. Here's Sky News breaking down the facts with Professor Clifford Stott of Keele University.
So if we were
to seek evidence for this phenomenon, what would that evidence look like? Where would we need to be looking at the data to see that two-tier policing isn't just a political buzz phrase?
Well, we have to look in particular beyond individual interactions. We can't draw from an analysis of that one episode how the police relate to the communities as a whole. So the argument about two-tier policing is that somehow there are disparities where white people are being treated differentially from ethnic minorities. Now, that is true, but it's ethnic minorities that actually receive more policing, more use of force, more use of taser, more likely to die in custody, more likely to be subjected to prosecution than white people. So I'm not saying that there aren't inequalities. It's not that certain elements of our community, certain parts of our community do receive differential forms of policing. And we measure that on an ongoing basis by looking at the patterns of policing across communities as a whole, across counties, across metropolitan areas, across the country as a whole. So as across the country as a whole, you're essentially between 4 and 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched. If you're black, you're more or less the same, more likely to be subjected to the use of taser if you're black than if you're white. So absolutely, when we look at the data and the evidence, it talks to us about policing inequalities, but they absolutely are not about how white people experience forms of policing that are exposing them less so than minority populations.
It's also worth pointing out, however, there is an intersectional case to be made that whilst people like Henry Novak are unlikely to be unfairly treated on behalf of their race, they could potentially be treated worse on grounds of class. To clarify, there is the evidence base for this too. The case review outlined how the police have adapted what is known as a warrior culture, and that the review made it clear that it had led to over-policing of poorer working class communities by pitting police against them in an us versus them narrative. There's also this study from 2022, which studied the prevalence of stop and search in London, for example, and then stratified it by levels of economic inequality, whilst controlling for crime rates and ethnicity. And it found that areas of the highest inequality had higher rates of stop and search, implying that the data suggests that the police tactic is being used as a means of social control against people from lower class backgrounds. We've talked beforehand, Dahlia, about the level to which the data shows that its ethnic minorities are overwhelmingly got worse outcomes in terms of policing in this country. What do you make of the kind of class argument here as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have this we've gotten into this really frustrating class versus race sort of doom loop where we seem to think that you can only really address one at any one point. And if you're talking about one, then you're not talking about the other when, under the system, under the way that capitalism exists today, it's like almost always you are talking about both at the same time. And they are relational and they shape one another and sort of looking at this question of where power lies in society today and saying, well, is it in class or is it in race? It's kind of like, it's like looking at a cake and being like, is this flour or eggs? It's like, well, they both are together making the thing that is capitalism, right? And I think what we have to remember is that policing and brutal policing only happens where power isn't. When you look at the foundation of modern policing, the Metropolitan Police is kind of considered to be the first modern professional police force. And the roots of the Metropolitan Police happen in 2 places. One is in the Thames River Police in the Docklands, and the other one is in Ireland. And in both contexts, the establishment of the police happens in for a very specific reason. And that specific reason is not to prevent harm. It's not to prevent crime. It is to protect property. So in Ireland, it's to control and subjugate a colonized population, to protect the ability of the British state to extract from that population. When you look at the Docklands, it's to ensure that, goods that are being transported from the colonies, from enslaved labor, are not stolen by local working class people, by dock workers, etc. So in both contexts, it's fine that the British state is like engineering famine in Ireland. The police we don't need to call the police for that. And we also don't need to call the police, or the police have nothing to do with preventing, slave owners from working their slaves to the bone and, stealing their labor. But what we need the police for is to protect property from loss and also contain the environment through which those two incredibly harmful, incredibly destructive systems can continue to happen. And so that is why we never see policing, brutal policing especially, happening in places where there's a lot of wealth and a lot of power. We see it happening in communities that need to be contained and need to be controlled, and not just in this kind of direct way where it's like, we need the police to prevent political dissension or whatever. It's also a matter of like, when there are social consequences and unrest that happens as a result of inequality, whether it's a mental health crisis, whether it's riots, whether it's theft, whatever it is, that response, the response to that can divert us away from the actual root causes. So it's like when there is social unrest, when there is conflict, when there is violence that emerges as a result of the way that power is structured, we respond to that by warehousing people in prisons or by restraining them and institutionalizing them, rather than looking at the core conditions of why this conflict or why this violence or why this unrest has happened. So indirectly, it maintains the environment through which this inequality can continue, because it purports to deal with the problems. It frames the problems as a problem that is inherent to criminality and people being criminals, rather than people arrive at certain circumstances because we live in a very unequal society that is also a very traumatizing society. And within that, working class people, racialized people, categories that overlap almost very consistently, experience the brute force of that. And where the stereotypes and the culture and the language come in is in the way that certain communities are written off as inherently violent or inherently less worthy than others. So we see this, for example, in Hillsborough, where you see this kind of like massive police neglect of a very acute, dangerous situation. And afterwards, we see the dehumanizing language and stereotyping language being used to explain away why all these people died at a football match, Whereas, so I think we have to understand that class and race are together things that define and mark human value. And they do it together, and they do it in a way that is very difficult to pass out. And where this brutal policing happens is places where power does not exist. And that is a place that is marked by class and race quite acutely.
And I think Hillsborough's a really, really, really good example, right? Because the media went with the police narrative from the off. You can't trust the words of the civilians here because they're from a lower class background. They're untrustworthy, right? The same is true of the grooming gangs too, right? These people were not taken seriously by the police because they were treated like slags, for example. They were treated as though they were like they were world weary was the term I think that was used.
They said they were things like risk seeking, thrill seeking.
Thrill seeking. Exactly,
I remember was the term that they used. And the great irony again of it is that the far right will take things that are genuine problems. For example, police brutality and the way that police respond to conflict and the way that police are deployed to deal with social problems, or the systematic misogyny and class prejudice, and not just class prejudice, but like genuinely just like the class fact of not having resources, and how that shapes the interaction of women who experience and girls who experience sexual violence with the police. And they make it virtually impossible for us to actually have that conversation, because it's like
the police, the media have an incentive to make it all about race, to make it into the woke policing discussion, rather than the reality, of course, because then you'd have to contend with an economic system that has created these billionaire people who are in media in the first place.
Contend with an economic system, contend with like patriarchy and like the fact that the most unsafe place for a woman or a girl is like actually not like in the context that a lot of these grooming gangs happen, but it's actually like in the home with like your husband or your father. Like that's not the conversation that they want to have. So it's like they make it virtually impossible for us to arrive to the solutions that would actually protect the people they claim to protect. And that makes us all less safe because we're not getting to a situation where, for example, the phrase defund the police is often used as an example of like insane wokery. But I think it would be quite nice actually if if we rethought how we deal with social conflict away from policing. An example is, I was walking on a bridge like a few weeks ago actually, and it was very dark and I saw this man and he was like very clearly agitated. He looked like he could have been on some kind of substance, or he just looked very, very distressed. And he was walking in a way that I was like, and he kept kind of like peering over the bridge. And I was looking at him and I was like, this man is going to fall off the bridge. But I don't know how to deal. I'm not a medical professional. Like, I can't kind of go up and like handle it myself. So I called 999, hoping that I could get an ambulance to come and be like, this man's having some kind of episode. I don't know what's going on, but he looks like he might hurt himself. And they would not send an ambulance. They were like, no, well, that's a police issue. I'm like, why? But I don't want the police, like, he's not done anything. Like, he's having an episode, he's having some kind of crisis. Why are the only people that I can call people who don't have any tools to respond to the situation other than violence and containment?
Totally agree.
And so defunding the police is about routing resources away from always having the response to social unrest being violence and containment and towards actual care, which in the vast majority of cases is what people actually need.
100% agree.